Thanks, Mark. This is Mike. So let me first tell you about the project and what we did here. So we partnered with 3 utilities, Arizona Public Service, Avista, and Con Edison, to research and identify best practices for pilot and demonstration projects to advance utility innovation. So in doing this, we've conducted in-depth interviews and evaluations with each of these 3 utilities to understand their innovation practices. We also conducted a wide range of interviews through our eLab network with industry stakeholders, including utilities, regulators, technology companies, advocates, and experts. And we hosted a collaboration workshop with members of these 3 utilities to synthesize the learning and develop and improve our recommendations, which we'll be sharing with you today. And included here is the link to download the full report. You can also search Pathways for Innovation, RMI, and find the report there. And once again, this file will be shared with webinar attendees later, so you'll be able to see this link again if you need it. So first off, just briefly, why do we even care about innovation? We've highlighted here a few major trends. Of course, there are many more, but we see the technology changes, customer demands, and regulatory action are disrupting the traditional model of the utility, both their business model and how they operate. And utilities will need to change and innovate in order to thrive in the new environment. So just to highlight a few of the ways this is occurring, many parts of the country are seeing increased generation from variable renewables, resulting in the need for more flexible and dynamic demand and supply. We're seeing in places, especially like Hawaii, California, Arizona, the saturation of neighborhood level circuits with new solar generation or with new load from electric vehicles. And this is driving the need for distribution system modernization. Many places are seeing revenue erosion at the utilities as both energy efficiency and distributed solar eat away at their energy sales, and resulting in the fixed costs of building and maintaining the grid being spread over a smaller sales volume. And this is driving the consideration of new utility business models and alternate revenue streams. And lastly, the proliferation of smart home devices that are connected and interact with the grid. Everything from smart thermostats to new water heater algorithms and more advanced managed electric vehicle charging, all of which is driving utilities and other energy providers to seek new ways to optimize these devices and their impact on the energy system. So, pilots and demonstrations. Now, across the country, the word pilot, the word trial, the word demonstration, these are used in quite different ways, but what we think is critical here is to identify the actual distinction between different types of projects. And so we have classified them here as pilots and demonstrations. And the pilots, in the darker orange here, are those often smaller scale projects, more limited in scope, focused on answering a technical question about how a new technology works or how it integrates with the energy system. The demonstrations, as characterized perhaps by some of the newer projects in New York State under the REV context, are more integrated. So in addition to testing new technologies, they're also exploring new business models, new pricing structures or market designs, and new ways of engaging customers and encouraging customer adoption. The demonstrations, being more integrated, are better prepared to scale to large-scale programs and are better prepared to offer a more holistic energy solution to customers. And here we'll see, we believe it's important that there's a logical progression from one type of project to the next. At the end of the day, pilots and demonstrations in and of themselves are not meaningful unless they lead to real change on the energy system at scale. So you can imagine that the criticism we heard from many stakeholders of utility pilots is that it's just pilot after pilot after pilot without meaningful impact. Or I believe one quote is that some utilities have pilot-itis and are just stricken with endless pilots. But, and while that's not true across the industry universally, we think there's a lot of value in more formally structuring the progression from different types of projects, from a pilot to a scalable demonstration to an actual rollout on the grid. Not that every concept or project needs to step through each phase, but that there should be a clear and logical process for advancing the concept forward after the completion of the project. So through our research, we've distilled recommendations around 5 themes: strategic planning, designing projects to scale, organization, stakeholder engagement, and cross-utility collaboration. And we'll now walk through these one by one to talk more about our findings. So to kick us off, I'm going to hand it off to Courtney Fairbrother to tell us about strategic planning.
Thanks for the introduction, Mike. As Mike mentioned in these next couple of slides, I'm going to go through our first best practice on integrating pilots and demonstrations into your company's overall strategy. So we recommend having your company embrace a strategy for energy transformation and crafting a complementary roadmap for that innovation. So in this figure, we're highlighting the 3 main pressures that are driving utilities to adopt a strategy of innovation. Advances in technology such as cheaper solar and electric vehicles are enabling new energy system designs, but the opportunity for utilities to engage with these new technologies really varies across the country depending upon the influence of these main factors. So the first being the customer demands for these new products and new technologies. The second is regulatory pressure for the adoption of renewables and storage and changes in their business model. And the last is their own internal utility motivations. So when all 3 of these pressures are combined, we find that this is where the most cutting edge utilities are really pushing ahead and the most rapid changes are occurring in the industry. It's important to note that utilities need to have their own internal motivation to really drive this innovation forward, and that customer demands and regulatory pressure on their own are really not enough to seek kind of broad system changes. So utilities that are embracing these technologies and are strategically positioning themselves for a future where they exist are really coming up with some of the most innovative solutions to integrate these technologies into the electricity grid. The next slide, Mike. Pilots and demonstration projects in and of themselves, as Mike was mentioning, are not necessarily that meaningful unless they're directly tied into the strategic vision of the company. If the link doesn't exist between pilots and demonstrations team and strategy overall, it's a real missed opportunity. So in order to align pilots and demos with the utility's strategic vision, utilities can build what we're calling an innovation roadmap that includes both the company's vision for the energy system transformation, as well as an understanding of the challenges that need to be solved to get to that future end state that they're hoping for in their strategy. So the innovation roadmap doesn't necessarily have to be a prescriptive plan for the exact pilots and demonstrations that the utility is going to conduct, or even the exact technologies that they're trying to test, but instead the roadmap should really highlight what the needs are and how new programs and even new business models could help to solve those needs. Then the strategy for pilots and demonstrations can be built off of that and can be built off of what needs to be tested to get the company to that vision and meet those needs in the future. So one thing to note is that this is a two-way streak because the results of the pilots and demonstrations should directly inform the future strategy of the utility overall as well. So the successes and failures they had with those tests should play into the next iteration of the strategic vision. So linking pilots and demonstrations directly to the company's strategy should make scaling of pilots and demos much easier once they're proven out because there's already that business case and tie to the company's goals. So next slide. So in these recommendation slides that appear in each section, you'll notice that we've broken out our recommendations by stakeholder just to make them a bit more digestible. So up first, we have utilities. and we have 3 recommendations for them. Utilities should really try to embrace the need to adapt and innovate in their corporate strategy. They should craft an innovation roadmap that prioritizes problems to solve for customers and the grid, not necessarily the exact pilots and demonstrations to meet those needs. And then lastly, they should really focus pilots and demonstrations on solutions that will support the innovation roadmap and inform their corporate strategy in the future. So up next, regulators. Regulators should really work to make sure that their own strategy is very clear and communicated well to utilities, so that utilities are able to build their own strategy and their own pilots and demonstrations to meet those needs. We often heard frustrations from utilities where they felt that the regulatory vision was unclear or inconsistent, and it was challenging for utilities to be able to design their own strategy and then their pilots and demonstrations to really meet those regulator needs. And often the pilots and demonstrations that they were designing were not getting approved because of that. So then next we have DER providers. DER providers should develop solutions that address customer, regulatory, and utility pressure for system change, designing their products and offerings to meet the needs of all of these stakeholders where possible. So up next, I'm going to hand it off to Anthony to discuss our next best practice, designing to scale.
Thanks, Courtney. So yeah, as Courtney just said, in this section, we're going to be talking about designing pilots and demos to maximize learning and preparing for more full-scale, larger-scale development. So the first thing I want to talk about in this section is defining what we mean when we talk about failure or success for a pilot or demonstration program. I think it's important to remember that these are experimental projects and learning is the primary objective. And so thinking about that, failure consists of running a pilot or demonstration project and coming away with inconclusive results, not gathering the data you need, for example, to make decisions, or failing to identify and capture important lessons. Conversely, success is learning either that you've answered the questions you need to scale the project up, or that you, in running the project, discovered that you don't want to scale the project and that you are going to stop investigating that product or service. So coming back to this pipeline of projects, once again, it's critically important to define where your project sits in the pipeline, whether it's a pilot, or exploratory pilot, a scalable demonstration, or a phased rollout. But it's also equally important to think about what happens in between these stages. So in the project planning stage and also post-project when you're evaluating results. And so just to reiterate what these different types of projects are intended to do, the exploratory pilot is more of an early stage project, an early stage test, really looking at technical feasibility and kind of grid integration, system integration things, and then maybe starting to test customer interest. These projects are a small scale, and there's some chance that they'll scale to full deployment if successful, but not necessarily a high chance. As you move on to a scalable demonstration, this is kind of those more integrator projects we're talking about that are testing things that may be issues at full-scale deployment. So the business model that will apply, how customers will be incentivized to take part in these services or buy these products, whether that's market or rate structures or some other type of incentive structure, testing broader cost effectiveness for customers and utility, and then also testing customer interest. I think a good way to think about this is kind of like the small scale, like fully loaded model of how you would deploy that product at scale. So this is a medium or larger scale project with a high chance of scaling if the project is successful. So you've tested all the barriers to scaling, and you've learned that you can actually scale that up. And so the last phase is last type of project would be a phased rollout. That's when you've decided you're going to roll out the product. And in this phase, you recommend doing it in phases so you can learn in between different phases and kind of refine and tweak as you go along. So once again, I think it's really important to think about what this means for project planning and then also results. And so in the project planning phase, it's really critically important to identify the barriers for moving the project to the next stage. Those could be technical barriers, they could be economic barriers, they could be more strategic barriers within the company, for example. But really clearly defining what those barriers are and what you would need to know to feel comfortable that you've addressed those barriers and are moving to the next step. And so flipping over to kind of the project evaluation phase, then you can look back at those kind of solutions you tested over the course of the project to address those barriers, whether or not they worked and whether they were successful. If they weren't, then maybe you stop pursuing that product, and then otherwise that will give you the I guess decision-making power to move the project on to the next phase in the pipeline. And yeah, once again, you really want to set criteria for what it means or what you need to know in order to move the project to the next stage. One other thing I want to highlight is that we think that there's a lot of opportunity for doing more demonstrations in the industry, that there's a lot of technical knowledge out there about different solutions that work, but really the problems are in deploying them at scale and moving them through this pipeline. So one other thing I want to address in this section is incentives. And so traditional cost of service regulation really offers limited incentives for energy system innovation. Under that model, the incentives, profit incentives, typically focus on growing your rate base or reducing kind of your expenses, your ongoing charges or expenses, and that small-scale pilots, even if they're rate-based, are relatively small compared to the larger rate base. And so we've seen some examples of new mechanisms that can spur more meaningful pilots and demos. I think New York is a good example with the REV proceeding, and then also, for example, in UK with performance incentive mechanisms that kind of give a different incentive other than rate basing, for example, energy efficiency or environmental outcomes that may give more of an incentive for utilities to innovate. And then also that there's maybe other market-based earnings or other opportunities that when pilots can scale up and become full-scale deployments, those become large, I guess, large potential earnings opportunities that, I guess, incentivize you to develop these new business models and products. So just to summarize some of our recommendations in this section, for utilities, it's really about planning to address those barriers to scaling, testing them in the projects, creating that formal pipeline so that you can test bigger and bigger questions, more integrated questions that could be barriers to scaling, and then also planning how you will move through that process, including who will be responsible for deploying that full-scale program. For regulators, we think it's more about the incentives and earning mechanisms that support utility innovation and new customer needs, looking to examples that we've seen in some states, and also setting the expectation that projects will scale up if successful, and that it's not a guarantee from the regulator that if a project is successful and answers all the questions that it will scale, but the expectation that there is this pathway and that these projects are really being done to enable new products and solutions to be deployed by the utility. And finally, DER providers, thinking a little bit about aligning products and services to that may be more specific to different stages of testing, whether it's a pilot or demonstration, and working closely with the utility to do that design together. Okay, so moving on to the next section, which is focused on organization. This is really about how you can restructure your organization to really support innovation, within your utility and also specifically for pilot and demonstration projects. And so in our research, we found that our recommendations fall into kind of three key principles that allow for innovation at utilities, and the three are leadership accountability, dedicated staffing, and cross-organization engagement. I think one good way to think about this is trying to make innovation just part of business as usual. So integrating into daily is just how the utility does business. And I think the impetus behind this is a lot of times pilots are run by small teams that are isolated from the rest of the organization that may not that really hampers them when they try to go scale those solutions. And so really it's about integrating those projects into how the utility does business. And so starting with the first one, leadership accountability, this one's really about responsibility. And so make it part of the job description for senior leadership, hold senior leadership accountable for the results of demos and pilots, and also for the scaling up of those pilots and demos. Second is dedicated staffing. And I think this one's more about the time and the resources. So while you have accountability and responsibility for the results of these projects and scaling up of these projects, it's also important that there's a carve out both within leadership and also other staff that would be designing and running these projects. So it's not just something that's done on top of your normal job. We've seen that in some cases that's kind of what happens, is that it's just an extra thing to do, and then those projects don't get the amount of dedicated support that they need to be successful. If your company is large enough, and this is possible, it's actually really good to have a dedicated team that's just working on these pilots and demonstrations and can really focus on these projects. The third one is cross-organization engagement, and this is really about ensuring connection between these projects and the rest of the organization. I think there's two big reasons for this. One is to gather feedback from across the organization. Most of these more integrated demonstration projects that we're talking about connect to different pieces of the organization, whether it's distribution planning or operations or maybe customer engagement. And so it's important to talk to those different groups in the planning stages to gather feedback, and that'll result in a better project than if it's done in a vacuum. And then also the second piece is generating support for the projects. And so since these other parts of the organization will be involved in ultimately rolling out a full-scale project, getting them on board in the beginning, understanding what the implications would be if it were to scale, and what kind of the needs are in advance will help when you do go to scale. People won't be surprised and caught off guard by that, and they'll be supportive and able to work with you in that. I think a good example that we found in our research was Con Ed, their new distributed resources integration group, led by a VP, really focused on demonstration projects in addition to looking kind of at the utility of the future. And it's also interesting that they're integrated. That same VP oversees energy efficiency programs and then some distribution planning. And so there's kind of good connection to other pieces of the organization that are already operating. So just to summarize the recommendations here, formalizing accountability for pilots and demonstrations is important, especially getting senior leadership support and maintaining that connection to strategy. If possible, dedicating a team to business model innovation, and if not possible, at least carving out time for key staff to work on those projects. Engaging other business units across the utility on the design and execution and evaluation of these projects. One good example from Con Ed was their cross-functional steering committees, which oversee demonstration projects and gather input from across the organization and also from others outside of the organization, which is very interesting. And then also encouraging innovative thinking within the company. We heard from all three of the utilities we worked with that they had structures in place so that staff of all levels with good ideas, those ideas could be incubated, brought to the senior leadership attention, and given the ability to grow when they have merit. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Courtney, who's going to talk about stakeholder engagement.
Thanks, Anthony. As Anthony mentioned in these next couple of slides, I'm going to discuss how effective stakeholder engagement can help to design pilots and demonstrations that are executed effectively. So next slide. Overall, we have observed kind of two main principles for utility engagement with external stakeholders. Utilities need to build common ground with external stakeholders such as regulators and DER providers, as well as effectively engage vendors in procurement and ongoing partnerships to really have pilots and demonstrations that are meaningful. Generally, we found that utilities are most comfortable with building their pilots and demos on their own. And through this model, we're proposing a new, more collaborative solution where they bring in those voices earlier on in the design phase. So engaging stakeholders in collaborative conversations and design of pilots before bringing pilot proposals to regulators is important for advancing innovative solutions with broad support. Particularly, I'm thinking about contentious issues like utility ownership of DERs. So in contested regulatory proceedings around the country, proposed pilots have been delayed or often even derailed by these stakeholder disputes. And if utilities are able to engage stakeholders in advance of proposing the pilots or demonstrations, they may be able to offset some of these problems and design pilots and demos that meet stakeholder needs as well as their own. So secondly, utilities should really try to better engage vendors and create partnerships by crafting effective solicitations, communicating clearly with these vendors on their own needs, and in some cases, integrating offerings from multiple vendors to really design the solution that they as a utility are looking for. So in order to do this, RFPs should not be overly prescriptive and should instead provide sufficient information without presupposing the best technology or solution set that is out there to meet those needs, and letting vendors propose options for the utility to meet their prescribed needs. So next slide. So our recommendations to utilities are to engage early with key stakeholders to really build a common ground and overcome contentious issues such as DER ownership, as I mentioned before, or utility ownership of DERs in the design phase of a pilot or demonstration. Next, they should craft vendor solicitations that emphasize customer and system needs rather than being really prescriptive. By doing this, they may receive solutions that they didn't even know existed before that meet their needs more effectively. And then lastly, they should try to participate fully in relevant stakeholder collaboration forums such as New York Rev. Then regulators should seek to encourage effective collaboration by encouraging utilities to work with interested stakeholders in advance of formal proceeding to design more effective proposals for pilots and demonstrations. And they should clearly state their regulatory preferences to really allow for these successful pilots. Lastly, with DER providers, they should make sure they're communicating the value proposition of their solution in a way that allows utilities to conduct an integrated demonstration, and they should seek to productively engage in a creative and innovative discussions with utilities. So look for ways that they can partner with utilities on an ongoing basis or innovate with utilities on a kind of iterative basis as opposed to just proposing solutions. So up next, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike to discuss our final best practice, cross-utility collaboration.
Thank you, Courtney. So what we mean by cross-utility collaboration is the sharing of best practices, lessons learned, utility to utility. So recognizing that utilities around the country are pursuing many of the same objectives through their own pilots, and there's an opportunity for information sharing. So here I'd like to just point out that the opportunity is pretty clear and compelling for utilities to build off of each other's work because they are facing similar challenges and opportunity. They're adopting the same types of technology and experimenting with similar business models. The utility industry in the U.S. is largely free of the same competitive pressures that many other industries would face, with some exceptions, but there's certainly an opportunity for utilities to benefit from more open sharing of the results of their own innovation practices than we would see in other industries. And the third point here is was counterintuitive to us because there's quite a wide range of electricity industry conferences and technical reports all over the place. But we found in speaking with folks at utilities that it actually creates a bit of information overload, and finding the right information, the right insights amongst everything else for a specific project or specific need can actually be quite challenging. You know, depending on how you count, there's up to 2,000 electric utilities around the U.S. of all different types, and it's really pretty impossible to know what everybody is up to. And so we heard several times that folks at utilities and regulators don't really have a full picture of what other utilities have found and learned in relevant pilots. So what to do about it? We have a couple points here to suggest. So on the utility side, first and foremost is that they can segment the industry a bit, look for those other utilities who are facing similar challenges, similar opportunity, and try to forge those connections. Typically, utility-to-utility communication is quite strong within the same state or region, but maybe weaker around the rest of the country. So it's strong geographically, but not as strong based on common interests, common needs. And so there's an opportunity for utilities on other sides of the country to seek each other out a bit more. The second, generally, just to be sure that you are incorporating learning from other utility programs in your own pilot or demo. And this may seem obvious, but the common reaction or common thing we've heard from a lot of utilities is, well, my system is different than other people's. And those differences are real and important, but there's a tendency to undervalue or underappreciate the opportunity for shared learning and building off of results elsewhere. And then third here, to develop those plans for the measurement and verification and evaluation of those pilots from the outset and for disseminating results. It is important that utilities are not only looking out to the industry to find the best information to inform their own pilots and demonstrations, but that they're producing meaningful reports and results that other people can learn from. And just as an example, we're seeing more and more utilities being very thoughtful about planning for a control group when they have pilots that affect many different customers. And so being very thoughtful and effective about how measurements and evaluation will be conducted from the outset allows them to produce not only for their own benefit, but for others, those really tangible results. For regulators, there's a few things they can do to create the right expectations and accountability among utilities. The first is to ensure that utilities are sharing those results effectively. And so this serves two goals. One, just within the context of that specific utility, facilitating an effective discussion when the time comes under a future regulatory proceeding to evaluate the merits of scaling that program up and increasing ratepayer funding often on that. So from the outset of a pilot or demonstration, if that's the agreement that the utility will go conduct a pilot and ratepayers will fund it, setting those regulatory standards for what the utility needs to report at the end of that pilot. Second, to create the expectation that utilities are learning from others around the country. And it's not that utilities necessarily don't seek to do this on their own, but that regulators, once again, can create a bit of a standard and an expectation that utilities are coming and explaining, yes, we want to use ratepayer funding to conduct this demonstration. Here's how we're building off of learning from elsewhere in the country, and here's why we're not using ratepayer funding to fund something that's redundant. The DER providers, they're actually in quite an opportunistic position because oftentimes these are companies who are very deep in one specific subject area, and they actually have a better view of what's happening around the country at different utilities with that particular technology or business model. And so where this is the case, they have an opportunity to facilitate this cross-utility learning, not only by making a good sales pitch, but also by directly enabling those utility-to-utility connections where one utility can learn in greater detail about what's happening elsewhere. And this may be particularly helpful with smaller utilities around the country that have fewer resources to devote to intensive research. And then other industry groups, there's kind of a broad array, RMI included, of organizations around the industry that are producing research reports and similar reporting. And so there is an opportunity here to provide more curation and synthesis, to look across the most important results from pilots and demos around the country and synthesize those learnings, tailor them to specific needs that utilities have, and make this brief and accessible and concise to help utilities navigate all of the information that's out there. And so there have been several real nice examples of this. National Labs included in evaluating some of the smart grid demonstration projects have done a nice job of synthesizing nationwide results on similar topics. So that concludes the takeaways from the reports. We're going to shift to questions in a moment. I did want to put in one plug here for another opportunity that's upcoming. So in this report, we described how we worked with 3 different utilities and facilitated collaborative meetings among them and tried to establish shared learnings that they could each benefit from. So we believe that this type of cohort approach is valuable to maximize shared learning. And there's another program coming up that we did want to inform folks about, funded by NREL and Department of Energy. It's called the Solar Energy Innovation Network. It's a 3-year private-public collaboration. NREL will be, the goal actually is to design or remove non-hardware barriers to wide-scale integration of solar and renewables in general. The application period is open now but closes August 1st, and seeking multi-stakeholder teams working on projects that will support renewables integration. The benefits to the teams will be both facilitation of this cohort model and shared learning, and technical assistance directly from NREL staff or other providers, which is fully funded, and some direct funding for the actual participation in the program themselves. So the link is here and will be available in the webinar materials that are distributed later, and the application is coming up quick, August 1st. So with that, we are going to move on to answer your questions. And we've got a couple here, so we'll take a look at the questions we have and spend the rest of the time answering them. So the first one I'm going to start with, the question, I don't see any mention of building operational experience and lessons learned. Isn't that a valuable outcome of a pilot or demonstration? So I'll take this one. I would say yes, absolutely, that's a valuable output. Building experience with the staff at the utility and building direct operational experience. However, I would say if that is the primary objective, if something is new to your utility, it's been demonstrated successfully elsewhere, and the main concern at your organization is building operational experience, then I would say that's a good use case for what we called a phased rollout earlier. So, this can be designed to start with a small portion of customers, or however it is useful to your organization to start small, build experience, and then grow. But the key design aspect of that type of project is that the utility has already determined that scaling up is beneficial for customers and for the system, and there's the intent to fully scale up. And the only variable is the pace of the rollout, of the phased rollout, and that allows for employees to build that experience as you go. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. So one question is, what would be the top? We've seen a bunch of recommendations, but what are the top 3 things that utilities should go do now? And Anthony, do you want to share a couple of the ideas that stood out to you as the top ideas?
Yeah, I think one of the critical ones is really establishing that senior leadership accountability and ownership over innovation and specifically pilots and demonstration projects. I think all the other things kind of can follow from that if you have directives from at the senior level that this is something that's important and there needs to be time and resources dedicated to that. I think second is building that strategic vision, and I think this would naturally flow from that first piece, and really establishing a clear direction for the company under which all these other activities can nest underneath. And then, yeah, establishing those formal linkages between the different phases of the project pipeline, and really ensuring that there's a process for how those projects move through the pipeline and get to full scale, because ultimately we are trying to get new products and services that can be deployed. And so I think that those are kind of the early steps to set up the groundwork for more innovation and good pilot and demonstration projects. Anything you want to add?
No, that's great. So the next question I see here, how much of this approach is market-specific, e.g. US-centric, versus applicable in other countries with state-owned utilities? I would say it's, these recommendations, most of them are pretty broadly applicable, most of the themes. The exact roles for regulators versus utilities will vary certainly in other contexts. But if we think about the top things that Anthony just mentioned, like establishing senior leader accountability for results of the innovation projects, I think that's just a fundamental organizational change that would apply at any organization. We're building the strategic vision for the energy system would be another one. And so, we've heard of examples where there may be a small team at a utility doing some very exciting projects, but those projects lack a clear link to the organization's overall strategy, and then suffer from a failure to get out of that pilot phase. And this, this kind of principle would really apply to any type of utility, or really broadly to many different types of organizations. So I think just some of these fundamental things about how projects advance and grow and scale and are designed are agnostic to the specific market. Great, let's go back to the questions list. The next one I see here, do you have examples of success stories? I would go to one in my mind. Well, I think there's two things in my mind, actually. There's several pilots or demonstrations that are underway right now, which we think are doing well. But the full success story, I would think, is one that's actually, we're seeing it scale already. So these are ones that were maybe in the pilot or demonstration phase in years past. And so just from our work with these three utilities, I might highlight Avista. And they participated in the Smart Grid Demonstration Project program funded by the Stimulus Act a few years back. So they had a rather large project in Pullman, Washington, which demonstrated some grid-side technologies like transformers with more connected capability and various types of SCADA, more advanced distribution management systems, and also their advanced metering infrastructure, including the platforms for notifying customers about usage and bills. So this, maybe 5 years ago these were technologies that were a little bit more in that demonstration phase and still figuring out how to integrate them. And now we've seen Avista commit to deploying most all of those programs out system-wide and receive regulatory approval to do the same. And so, the things I would say they did well were deploy them across a wide area in an integrated manner that included how they engaged customers and what the business model elements were. And then they were able to make a comprehensive evaluation of the program merits, including the business model, customer engagement, and pricing aspects, and then bring together really a fully packaged proposal to scale it out across the system, which they're now doing. And then as far as projects that are underway now that we think are innovative, but also follow many of the principles we've designed here, I think I would turn it back over to Courtney. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what APS is doing with their solar studies.
Sure. So APS a few years ago released their solar innovation study demonstration, where they were working with a small number of households in Arizona to try to figure out how to more effectively use solar and other demand-side resources. But the part that I thought was really innovative and very cool about this particular demonstration was the fact that they were coupling rate design with this technology and trying to figure out how certain rates might directly impact a customer's usage and what is most effective. And so they were doing a lot of side-by-side testing or A/B testing of different technology types and different rate structures to figure out what was the most effective one in order to really think through how customers might use solar on the grid and how they could encourage customers to use demand-side resources to really help benefit Arizona in general. Any other ones from Mike or Anthony that you guys would like to mention?
Yeah, actually, I'd like to mention Con Edison's projects, and specifically one of them that came out of their the new demonstration projects team, and I think is a good example of the benefits of running kind of a broad solicitation process and getting ideas from outside the organization, and then B, just the kind of innovative projects that can come out of that. So the one I want to highlight is their mobile battery demonstration project. And basically the concept there is that there'll be batteries that will be mounted onto a truck that can drive around their system and respond to kind of real-time needs on the distribution system. And so trying to, I think that broadly when you look at storage and battery storage with cost declining, a lot of it is figuring out the business model that works, and ways to make it's a very flexible resource and ways for using that resource across the system. And so I think it's really interesting that ideas like that, when you have a really broad process, you can get really innovative ideas that might not be typical ideas coming out of the utility. So I think that's a great project.
Great. I'm going to move on to another question I see here. It reads, I see some utilities claiming they do not need new capacities or capabilities due to a flat demand growth. They're less interested in innovations in their system. What could be done for this type of utility? And I'd refer back, we shared a chart at the beginning. We think there really are three driving forces. One is demands from customers. The second is demand from regulators. And the third is the utility's internal motivation. And so, the questioner here is highlighting the case where the utility's internal motivation is lacking. And I would expect that meaningful change is unlikely to happen unless the other two, one or both of the other two driving forces emerge. So, we've seen across the southwestern U.S. and Hawaii and other parts of the world where the customer demand for rooftop solar has been a huge driver of the need to change and respond and react. And it's just fundamentally untenable for the utility to both incorporate large amounts of distributed solar and not change how they operate or maintain their distribution infrastructure or to seek new business models. And or on the regulatory side, I would highlight New York under the REV proceeding as a primary example of how a regulator with a vision for change is driving all the utilities in the state, regardless of their varying levels of inherent internal motivation to make this change. And I think we've seen in each of those cases, once those customer demands emerge or once the regulatory pressures emerge, even if a utility is at a lower level on that internal motivation metric, that increases over time as the utility recognizes more and more the need to change and innovate and stay ahead of the disruptions they're facing. Great. Well, let's see. Let's go back to the list here. I see, similarly, what can the DER companies do to more proactively support better pilots? And I'll offer one or two and then see if Anthony or Courtney have others. The first, we had a whole section on stakeholder engagement. We encourage utilities to not only develop solutions within their own walls, but to pull back the curtain a little bit and engage other parties. I think there's a reciprocal responsibility for the technology companies to come in with an open mind into those types of discussions, to be a bit less, to not approach those in a combative fashion, and to approach them in a collaborative manner, and seeking solutions that actually support customers in the grid and take advantage of the technology companies' capabilities, rather than really framing it as, solar versus the utility or whatever other DER technology versus the utility. Courtney or Anthony, anything you would add on what DER or technology companies could do?
Sure, I can add one in. One thing that we heard a couple of times throughout the course of our engagement was the need for DER providers to really think through and understand what that particular utility's business model looks like and what their needs are, and making sure that their solicitation or the product that they're offering really fits within that utility's particular business model, and recognizing that the utility also has to get benefits out of the technology that they're offering as well, and designing their offering to really meet those benefits and meet the needs of that particular utility was just a minor thing that we had heard a few times throughout the course of our research.
Great. I've got one more question I think we have time for here. The question, could there be a process where the customer, the host site, or the community, some actor other than the utility, could propose an innovative project to the PUC, and that could start the process of discussion rather than waiting for the utility to initiate it? So certainly I think there's room for other stakeholders to initiate the process of identifying innovative solutions. And now whether you propose it to the PUC, which route you go, I think probably varies by context, but I'll share one example which may illuminate one approach. So Duke Energy, the utility in North Carolina, much of North Carolina, in their western territory of North Carolina, had made some plans in their integrated resource planning to meet the growing energy demand, because it is growing in that region. Their plans included a new natural gas peaking plant, which would need to be in place in the next 5 to 10 years to meet growing demand. The community of Asheville, North Carolina, in this case, and the county and some other stakeholders decided that they were pretty strongly opposed to this new power plant going in, and they were quite interested in energy efficiency, distributed generation, demand response, other innovative solutions that could obviate the need for this plant. And so in this case, there was a bit of a community reaction to a utility's business as usual proposal, and the community stakeholders, the utility, and many local advocacy groups and industrial customers came together in a collaborative task force. They're calling it the Energy Innovation Task Force, to seek solutions that meet everyone's needs. So in this case, the community kind of came back to the utility first rather than the PUC, and was able to find common ground and a receptive audience there and build that approach. So we are at the end of our time. I thank you all for joining, and please do download the reports and send any other follow-up questions to us. Our emails are here. And once again, the webinar has been recorded, will be available along with the presentation materials. Thank you all. Have a great day.